Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today I want to celebrate Tag Tuesday a little early, just for a change, let my nerd flag proudly fly, and try to get pulled into neither political rants nor the dark academia aesthetic as I respond to the University Book Tag, a set of questions put together fairly recently by the relatively new booktuber Joe Spivey. I suspect you've all found Joe's channel already, but if not, I highly recommend his videos. He's smart and funny and well-read, and yet quite honest and quite excited about how much classic literature he still has to read. His videos always make me not only laugh, but do some thinking. So, on to the first question. Etymologically, the word university is derived from the Latin universitas magistrorum et scholarium, meaning a community of teachers and scholars. What was the last book you read written by two or more writers in coordination? I have one on my figurative nightstand, my e-nightstand, right now, called DAYSWORK by Chris Bachelder and Jennifer Habel, published just a few months ago, and which my neighbor recommended. This book takes place during the pandemic lockdown, while a woman is trying to, as the book's description says, make sense between what is fact and what is fiction in Herman Melville's novel Moby Dick. She becomes utterly absorbed in both his intense friendship with Nathanial Hawthorne, the author of The Scarlet Letter, etc., and also with his marriage to Elizabeth Shaw. Soon, the main character gets absorbed in the lives and relationships of various Melville scholars and fans as well, including Elizabeth Hardwick and Robert Lowell. And of course, these interests reflect and encourage her to contemplate her own marriage and her own writing. I haven't started it yet, but it sounds fantastically nerdy and also quite emotionally complex. From what I understand, DAYSWORK is written by a married couple, but told from the perspective of one character. I do want to mention another couple of other books written by two authors. One is called Unspeakable and is a University Press book I wrote with my colleague Susan Burch back when I was a practicing academic historian. I won't talk about the subject matter in detail here, but I will link to a booktube discussion I had about the book with a set of so-called booktube luminaries, to use Sean the Bookmaniac's term. Our joint book was written not specifically from one of our perspectives, but from a single narrative voice, and was a fascinating project for us to take sections I wrote the first draft of and sections she wrote the first draft of and edit them to fit together as seamlessly as we could. And Unspeakable isn't the only jointly written book I've worked on. Some of you know that I'm trying to finish a very different kind of double-authored book, a joint memoir partly about the healthcare system and illness and end-of-life issues. David and I were alternating voices from chapter to chapter, rather than writing with a single narrative voice. Have you read any books by two authors where you were especially intrigued by the way the authors presented the narrative voice or voices? I'd love to hear down in the comments. Okay, the second question for this tag is, in 1088, the University of Bologna saw the advent of the university as we recognize it today. What is your favorite or most recently read novel set in Italy? I have incredibly fond memories of reading The Passion, an early novella by Jeanette Winterson, back when I was in university. I think it might have been the first contemporary literary fiction I had ever read. I grew up reading a lot of 19th century British fiction and a lot of 20th century American fiction, but almost all of it was by authors that, at least to a degree, were considered classic. I also read a fair bit of contemporary fiction, but it was always very light, humor or mysteries, etc. An English major friend of mine gave me a copy of both The Passion and Sexing the Cherry for my birthday one year, and I read both of them the very next day. Much of The Passion takes place in a very magical Venice. A couple of years later, when I started dating David, I shared my copy with him, and he loved it just as much as I did. and I haven't read it since. Occasionally, I think about rereading it, and I worry that it might not wear well for me. I'm older now. I've read a lot more contemporary literary fiction to compare it to, etc. And honestly, there are a lot of reasons I have more fears about reading this particular book again because of its subject matter. Have any of you read it recently? I'd love to hear what you think. Question number 3. University study usually involves a significant change of residence or lifestyle. What is your favorite book focusing on an immediate change of residence? When Aaron Facer did this tag, he mentioned Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, and of course that made me think about Jane Eyre by Emily's sister Charlotte Bronte, and the importance of changing residencies in that book, about Jane's effort to find a home and eventually to make a home. I really appreciate when tag questions make particular themes stand out in stark relief in ways that I hadn't quite realized before. Even for a book like Jane Eyre, which I probably read 2 or 3 dozen times. Interestingly, I am about to reread Jane Eyre yet again, this time in a 3-part class at one of my local bookstores, a discussion which will be led by a scholar from one of the nearby universities. I can't wait, and I will let you know more about the experience when it gets started. The 4th question. The 21st century university student is expected to fork out tens of thousands in order to breach a university's sun-gilt facilities. Name a book that cost you an exorbitant amount in exchange for little reward. I read a lot of academic history books from university presses, very few of which I talk about here on this channel, but which are usually quite pricey. Due to their limited commercial appeal, not many copies are printed, and therefore the cost is very high per book. And that cost is passed on to readers. But the question of getting little reward makes me want to give a different answer. The backstory here is that I really love the 20th century British author Barbara Pym, someone I've read on repeat since I was about Joe Spivey's age. At some point, I heard that a biography of her was coming out many months in the future to be written by Paula Byrne, a scholar whose work I know and who was married to the well-respected scholar Jonathan Bate. The book was only to be released in the UK, it appeared, and after I waited so long for it to be released, I decided to treat myself to a brand new hardback, and the pricey, colorful, thick edition appeared on my doorstep in the US. And when I read it, I was extremely disappointed, even irritated by the biography. After a while, the book was in fact released in the U.S. edition, and I was asked to write a review for publication in a U.S. newspaper's book section, an opportunity that I declined. Had I known that a U.S. edition was in the works, and had I had the patience to wait, I could have received a free review copy. While I don't recommend the biography, I definitely do recommend Barbara Pym. On to question number 5. Universities and their attached student unions boast innumerable societies that gather zealots of everything from badminton to beard trimming to bardolatry. Name your favorite book that crafts or envisions a new or alternate society. About 20 years ago or so, a fair number of my climate activist friends began talking about another threat that seemed to be coming our way, the idea of peak oil. The standard definition of peak oil is that moment when we reach the maximum rate of global oil extraction. And after that maximum is reached, oil supplies will start declining, even if our dependence on or hunger for more oil is not declining. For a while, people thought we might be reaching peak oil within just a few years, or even faster. For a variety of reasons, that didn't happen. Just to be clear, the fact that it didn't happen doesn't mean peak oil is not on the horizon. The question is not whether it's real, but when it will happen, what protections we might develop beforehand, and how things will play out in a society afterwards as we try to adjust to a world with less power. If you're not familiar with peak oil, I'll let you read more about the doomsday scenarios that many people feared it would cause. Here, rather than talking about various speculations about apocalypse, I want to talk about how people tried to imagine ways to deal with it. Some people built underground bunkers, stored enough powdered nutrition and water to last for years, and armed themselves to the teeth. Others thought of less personal and more social responses. Most of them were responses that would be helpful to climate change as well as peak oil, a less consumer-based culture, more commitment to handmade things, etc. There was also an emphasis on a local supply chain rather than a global one. That is, buying rutabagas from local farmers during the cold season instead of purchasing strawberries and kiwis flown in from near-tropical countries. There was even an emphasis on growing as much of your food in your own backyard as you could, etc. The book I want to mention was written by a brilliant woman named Sharon Astyk and was called Depletion and Abundance: Life on the New Homefront. She followed it up with a couple of more specifically practical books, but this first book of hers really lays out the kind of world she envisions. The terrible hardships, but also a kind of deep community and self-reliance that echoes some of the Little House on the Prairie dreams a lot of us Americans grew up with. The difference is that she combined those dreams with a truly deep commitment to restorative justice. Her belief was not just that justice was the right thing to do, but that it was the only thing that would save us all during what she suspected might be social violence as we faced peak oil and climate change. While the book was excellent, and I can imagine it would be fascinating to read now, I also want to tell you how I found her work. Back in the day, I had a small and anonymous book blog. Back before BookTube and Bookstagram and BookTok, I followed many other people's blogs, and I ran across one with a title that completely charmed me, Casaubon's Book, referring to George Eliot's Middlemarch. Question number 6. What is your favorite novel set within the walls of a university campus? The most recent book I read partially about university life is Willa Cather's novel, The Professor's House, which I liked tremendously, and which still is playing through my head almost every day. I seem to be one of the very few people who has not read Stoner by John Williams, but now that someone has told me that it's similar to The Professor's House in some ways, I think I need to pick it up. With its totally different tone, I have enjoyed the very funny, very snarky, and yet still sort of depressing work by Julie Schumacher about the experience of being a humanities professor in a contemporary U.S. university. In Dear Committee Members, Professor Jason Fitker teaches English and creative writing at Payne University, where his office basically gets moved to a basement full of mold and asbestos, while upstairs, the more popular and financially lucrative economics department gets a lavish redo. Although his most significant genre is letters of recommendation, he does start to write a retelling of Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener, with its famous quote, "I would prefer not to." The 7th question. Universities are touted as bastions of free thought and uninhibited expression. Name a book you've read that is produced by someone with whom you fundamentally disagree on the subject, but you like because of the eloquence with which it's written. I love this question. The idea of really appreciating something that takes a really different approach than we might want to is something that doesn't happen a lot in our society these days. I mean, it does still in at least segments of academia, where the whole field might revolve around a set of differences in interpretation. But those differences are fundamentally kind of small potatoes. Even the old foundational questions in U.S. Southern history, for example, was slavery an anti-capitalist system or a system that was explicitly capitalist, for example, fundamentally could only get a fairly small rise out of most people. But I'll try to answer with at least a less academic book. Last fall, I read a slim volume tracing how various authors over time talked about the American novelist WILLA CATHER. That sounds like it would be academic, but it really isn't that kind of book. I'm talking about WILLA CATHER and the Politics of Criticism by Joan Acocella. She makes arguments that had me cackling aloud, even though I totally thought she was wrong-headed on a whole lot of her arguments, including condemning some scholars with stuff taken completely out of context. But despite its interpretive errors, I'll say, this book was nonetheless the most spirited book I've read in a really long time. Question number 8. Universities pride themselves on cherishing outpourings from previously silenced or oppressed minorities. Name a favorite book written by someone from an underrepresented group. In his answer to this question, Steve Donahue mentioned Ilan Pappé, a Jewish Israeli historian who has been outspoken for a long time about the history of aggression against Palestinian people, a perspective that Steve and many other people find quite surprising. But Pappé was not all that unusual among Jewish Israeli scholars from the 1980s and 1990s and even onward. These university historians used Israeli documents that had just been declassified at the time about what had happened during the beginnings of the State of Israel, things like the Nakba, the Palestinian expulsion. The so-called new historians have written dozens of books that have told a radically different story from what many of the multiple popular books about Israel have said. Instead of using the Hebrew Bible as the historical source, these scholars rely on traditional academic historical documentation, such as government paperwork, but also genetic studies and archaeological evidence to present a more complex narrative than the idea believed by many Jews, at least in America, that Israel was a land without a people for a people without a land. A glib quote that the new historians explained was utterly false in a variety of different ways. Although I've read many of the studies by the new historians over the last 30 years, I'm ashamed to say that I have never read academic studies by Palestinian historians and social theorists other than Edward Said. Right now, I have a couple of such books, I was going to say on my nightstand, but they're actually right here. The 100 Years' War on Palestine, written by the scholar Rashid Khalili, and Palestine, A 4,000-Year History by the scholar Nur Masalha. After I finish reading both of these books, as well as another sort of related book, I might do a fuller discussion about the subject. But I have some serious reading and learning and thinking to do first. Onwards. Question 9. University study can be riddled with dense, impenetrable scholarly tomes. What is your favorite piece of interpretive nonfiction written by an academic? As I've alluded to, I read a lot of interpretive nonfiction by academic historians, many of whom are my friends, or at least peers. I'll point you to one by my former co-writer Susan Burch called Committed, Remembering Native Kinship in and Beyond Institutions, about the adults and children from a variety of Native communities who were institutionalized in a federal hospital in South Dakota called the, quote, Canton Asylum for Insane Indians. Her powerful book, which was first released in 2021, I think, is available for free on Kindle and other ebook formats because Susan, Middlebury College, where she teaches, and her university press all want to make her book as accessible to all readers as possible. I'll leave the link below. Because I know many of you are more interested in reading books more directly about novelists and their books rather than academic history, I'll also recommend a book by Maggie Doherty about creative women during the period when modern feminism was just beginning to emerge in the U.S. These women were in the first cohort of a newly developed year-long fellowship at Radcliffe, what was then Harvard's sister college. This book, called The Equivalents, A Story of Art, Friendship, and Liberation in the 1960s, is fantastic and accessible. The author is well-versed in both the literature and history of the period. I'm pretty sure I wrote a formal published review of this book, and if I find it, I'll leave a link to it down in the description box. At any rate, The Equivalents was written by a scholar who received her PhD from Harvard, but from what I understand, Doherty was not offered a tenure-track academic job when she went on the job market, something that's not at all uncommon in the humanities these days. Although she was able to get a series of visiting professorships and adjunct jobs for a semester or a year, she eventually made the decision to focus instead on publishing literary criticism and essays in venues such as The New Yorker, The Nation, the New York Review of Books, etc., as well as publishing her book with a major commercial press. Academia's loss, for sure. So all that is left to do is tag people. Since this tag was created by Joe Spivey, a wonderful and fairly new booktuber, I want to tag a couple of people who have just started their own channels, both of whom I think are fully nerdy enough to appreciate this tag. First, I'll tag David of the channel Polyglot Reading, who reads and discusses books written in English, but also German, Italian, Yiddish, and French. He's got a really lovely style in his videos, calm, but also really engaged with the great diversity of what he's reading. Next, I want to tag James at Quaint and Curious Volumes, who I am thrilled to find out is interested in not only regional literature, which I talked about a bit in my last video, but also old-time music, folk music, especially music from North Carolina. As the daughter, sister, and mother of men who are deeply connected to folk music, especially banjo, including from North Carolina, I feel I might just have found yet more, at least fictive kin, here on BookTube. Thank you so much, Joe, for putting this great tag together. And thanks to all of you for joining me here today on Hannah's Books. See you soon.